very heartrending. And I don't know if anyone here has watched John Pilger's video on both Palestine and also the 500,000 Iraqis who died between 1990 and 2000 due to UN sanctions where they couldn't actually get any medical supplies. But it seems to me there's only three sources of a solution. The detail is important that we've seen tonight, but the bottom line is, when will the Palestinians get justice and when will there be a Palestinian state? And I'm very pessimistic about that. It seems to me that there are three possible sources for a solution. One is if America changes its attitude. The Israeli lobby in America is enormously powerful and will be enormously powerful for the next generation or two. So I actually don't think that's going to happen. Secondly, the Arab states, Egypt, Saudi Arabia, the Gulf, there is an awakening of democracy, but that's going to take some time. If Saudi Arabia was a democratic country, if most of the Arab states were democracies who actually represented the real people of their country, they would never allow their Arab brethren to suffer. The Saudis don't care at all about a Palestinian life. They're not important. That will take 30, 40 years. So then we are left with Europe. Why is it that a British government actually supports the Israelis, as Nick Ferriman has said? Why is it that Europe, anytime a Palestinian kills an Israeli, it's terrible. Anytime an Israeli kills a Palestinian, you hardly get any information. I lived in an Arab country for 7.5 years, and I saw home videos similar to the film we've seen tonight. And when I went back to Britain, I used to talk to people about that. And people refused to believe me that Israeli tanks would go into a civilian area and fire shells. So the level of ignorance is incredible. Most people in Britain who I've spoken to, their general impression is Arabs and Israelis have been fighting for thousands of years, just leave them to it. They have no idea about the history and about how the Palestinians were dispossessed. But I'd just like to ask the panelists, where do you see a practical solution coming in the next 30 or 40 years? Because I personally, sadly, am very pessimistic about it.
Thanks very much. Thank you. Sorry, what was your name again?
John.
John. Hi, John. Broadly speaking, actually, I agree with that assessment. The only slight glimmer of hope that we are seeing is the fact that there is this Arab awakening that is beginning to emerge, and some of it has been quite unexpected. Like, I mean, nobody thought that what happened in Tunisia and Cairo would take on that kind of a scale. I mean, this was not on the script. This was not supposed to have happened. And yet it did, and it caught a lot of people, the script writers, pretty much off guard. So there is a slight glimmer of hope, because this popular feeling within the Arab world is not going to go away very soon, and it is only going to continue to widen the chasm. Particularly now, as you can see, there is a clear demarcation, again, a continuation of this double standards policy, where some dictators are being supported, and they have now actually been rebranded as virtuous autocrats, deserving of the support, while the rest are going to become victims of regime change because they are not on the side of the West. However, having said that, I think I do have some faith in the power of public uprisings. And between now and September, when this whole issue comes up before the General Assembly, and there is actually going to be a vote, and due to other developments like this unity between Hamas and Fatah, even though some people say it's an illusory unity, it's something better than nothing. The other factors that are coming into play, like like Egypt beginning to reassert itself on the global stage. I think if some of these issues begin to have the necessary impact in the foreign policy establishments, plus the flip side of it, which is the price that is being paid by the publics in Europe and the United States in terms of the sheer drain of resources, the monumental amount of money that is being spent on maintaining the status quo, and the amount of jobs and other things it could create if that money was to be diverted and put into infrastructure development, into poverty alleviation, into environmental issues, and the huge rising tide of and how all the boats could be lifted if this particular problem could be solved, and that money and brain power and other resources freed up to solve the world's bigger problems. Maybe I'm stupid, but I do have some sense of optimism that eventually, somewhere along the way, this will prevail. That the sheer rationale of getting this problem out of the way, so that the world can move on to the many bigger problems that are confronting it, and that eventually the power of public opinion within the Arab world will also begin to rise. But we've been naive enough to believe that that might still prevail. As far as if you just leave it in the hands of the decision makers, as Nick said and as you very rightly pointed out, if you just leave it to the current level of decision makers and allow them to get on, all you're going to get is the continuation of the status quo, and then and hence obviously the same pessimistic scenario. But I just have that little glimmer of hope. Maybe I'm naive, but
Nick?
Yeah, I'm reasonably optimistic, but also pragmatic. There are issues. There are power issues here. I would like to look first of all at Egypt. I think Egypt's going to be a key player in this. We've seen that Arab Spring, and a huge amount took place in Egypt. And we ought to remember that Rafah is that border town that straddles Gaza on one side and Egypt on the other. And even the interim government, which is has a very strong military flavor to it, has been making big signals about the fact that it plans to open up the border with Rafah. If that is the case, that means the blockade will effectively come to an end. That 4-year blockade of Gaza will be terminated. So we'll have to really watch and see what goes on there. We'll have to watch and see what pressure is brought to bear by the Western powers to make sure the regime doesn't open that up. So that's going to be an interesting one to watch. But I think the vast majority of ordinary Egyptians have a huge amount of sympathy for the Palestinians. And to them, the Palestinians is a metaphor for the dictatorial. Israel is basically occupying it for 45, 50 years now. So that's a long-running dictatorship. So they have a lot of sympathy for the Palestinians. So I think there's going to be a lot of pressure on the military to do something about that. And if we do get proper elections in Egypt, I think that's even more likely to happen, this opening of the Rafah border crossing. I think also in the West there are some serious movements underway. Last year we had the flotilla back in May, about this time last year, wasn't it? And remember that incident on the Mavi Marmara when 9 Turks were killed. Turkey is a big player in this scenario as well. I think there were 900 people on about 7 or 8 ships. There's a flotilla planned. It's just been delayed to after the Turkish elections in June. This next flotilla will be twice as big, twice as many ships. And it's going to be interesting to see what happens with that one. I would think that even if the Rafah border is opened up, they're going to be symbolically arriving and trying to break that siege anyway. But I'm a little bit worried too about this flotilla, not because of what I think they're going to do. It's going to be another non-violent movement as well to try and break that blockade. But I was very concerned to hear about 2 or 3 weeks ago there was a donor meeting in Brussels. The donor meeting, this is the donor states, these are the European states that provide money into Palestine. they issued a statement saying that they regarded the planned flotilla that was going to break the seas coming up soon as a provocative act. Now, the blockade is a gross miscarriage of justice there. And here we have the donor states, these Western states, turning around and saying that the planned flotilla is a provocative act. Now, there was no message of Israel, there's a flotilla coming, don't you do anything. It was the other way around. It was telling the flotilla not to do something. So what sort of defense, physical, legal and moral defense, are we going to see if that flotilla comes under attack and we see Westerners start being killed? Are we going to see the same blocking what happened with Tom Herndl and Rachel Corrie and James Miller? So I don't think that's the right signal our donor governments, these Western governments, have sent out to Israel. They've sent out the reverse signal. So I'm worried about that. But anyway, I think there's several things happening there on the Egyptian front, on the flotilla front, and also bear in mind that in September we may have the a declaration of independence of Palestine anyway, pushed through the UN. And if that happens and Palestine does become an independent state, it means people like Imtiaz will be able to cross over into Palestine without having to go and get a visa from the Israeli embassy. So that's going to make some significant differences to the lives of Arabs and other people getting into Palestine. So I'm reasonably optimistic. Thank you.
Thanks for the question. I'd just like to add, interesting to note that one of those Turks on the Mavi Marmara was also American citizen, and again, just like with Rachel Corrie, the Americans did nothing at all, make any representations whatsoever to Israel about the death of their citizen. Yeah, I saw. Could you go to the microphone, please? Did I see another hand raised as well? If you could get ready after this questioner. Again, if you could tell us your name anyway, please.
How do you do? My name is Jack Hester, and I'm a retired teacher and musician, and not at all articulate in world affairs or politics. But Nick, if you are envisioning the actual possibility of a Palestinian nation, how would you envision that being formed? And they always talk about East Jerusalem being their capital city. How can you make a capital city out of half a city?
Let me try and gather my thoughts on this one. How is it going to come about? I think we can go back. I think there's a historical background to this. There's the UN Partition Plan of 1947 that says that said that there should be both a Jewish state and a Palestinian state side by side. I think one of the embarrassments for the UN back in 47 was in fact that partition plan, which offered 55% of the land to only 30% of the population, the Jewish population, most of whom had only immigrated in the last 20 years prior to that. So the actual partition plan itself was a violation of the UN's own charter, that is to say self-determination. The majority of the population, 70% of the population, were only given 45% of their own historic homeland. So that was actually a violation of the UN's own charter, as I said. It also violates self-determination. So I think there's been a residual embarrassment within inside the UN about what they did. One of their very first acts as the UN was to commit this massive